The Fashion Lab, which is a program that started a year and a half ago. It's a fusion of art and fashion. It's a Craft Alliance program, and it's been a really exciting opportunity to really learn from the pros about the art of fashion. And Valerie Steele is, as fashion's preeminent intellectual force, I think. It's really a treat to hear from her this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce Saskia Byron, who is the woman responsible for convincing Valerie Steele to come to St. Louis. Also is the Fashion Lab guru at Craft Alliance to introduce Valerie Steele. So thank you for coming. And consider joining Fashion Lab if you haven't already, because we have a wonderful, wonderful schedule of events and opportunities to meet with the forces of fashion. I also do want to say thank you to Robin Verhege-Abrams, who's back there somewhere, because this is a collaboration with Washington University, and the Yarn series has been something that's really enhanced the Fashion Lab. So thank you very much, Robin. And if Buzz Spector is in the room, thank you, Buzz.
Thank you all for coming. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest speaker today. A woman of great intellect and style, she devised a common perception that fashion is shallow and frivolous. She has written numerous books covering topics ranging from corsets to fashion icon Daphne Guinness. And as the director and chief curator of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, she has curated an awe-inspiring variety of exhibitions, including Gothic, Dark Glamour, Love and War, The Weaponized Woman, and Japan Fashion Now. And on top of all that, and Valerie, you may want to think about a comic book type person and decide on a superpower like flying. It would be really cool, because she also is editor-in-chief of the magazine Fashion Theory, the journal of dress, body, and culture. Named one of fashion's 50 most powerful by the New York Daily News, and dubbed the high-heeled historian by the New York Times, please welcome Dr. Valerie Steele.
Okay, can you hear me? Is that working? All right. Fashion, especially haute couture, which is handmade, is often described as an art. And certainly, if you look at something like this beautiful classical Balenciaga evening dress, if it's displayed on a pedestal or behind in a glass case in a museum, it has some of the aura of a work of art. But you have to remember that it's produced within the fashion system, not within the art world. It's true that the exhibition of fashion in museums has contributed to blurring the boundary between fashion and art. And in addition, a number of fashion designers have positioned themselves as being a kind of artist. Nevertheless, as we'll see, many other fashion designers have emphatically denied that fashion is art. So several years ago, I had a symposium about fashion and art. And in it, I gave a kind of preliminary version of this talk. And afterwards, a member of the audience came up to me and said that she was really shocked. She said, how could you, of all people, even question that fashion is art? But the relationship between fashion and art is very, very complicated. And it doesn't at all mean that I don't think fashion is wonderful. I've devoted my whole life to fashion because I think it's so wonderful. But I don't necessarily think that it's art. So the question is, what is art? We've been seeing for quite a while that this question of the relationship between fashion and art has been interesting people in both worlds, the fashion world and the art world. But who decides whether fashion's art? Art is usually understood to be, and I'll give you some very sort of high-tech theoretical language, it's usually thought to be a restricted field of high cultural production, including painting, sculpture, architecture, music. By contrast, fashion is usually seen as an industry, admittedly a creative industry, but still an industry and part of daily life. So two very different kinds of categories. Historically, fashion has tended to be dismissed as superficial, ephemeral, and material. By contrast, art has been valorized as significant form, eternally beautiful, and spiritual in nature, although these qualities have all been radically questioned by modern artists. Because fashion changes, because change is absolutely at the heart of fashion, it has seemed to many people to lack the qualities of truth and ideal beauty that art supposedly represents. Other cultural critics have attacked fashion as being capitalism's favorite child, arguing that stylistic changes in dress are only explicable in terms of capitalist greed and consumer credulity. Here, of course, we see an artwork which is commenting on the consumer aspect of fashion. Thus, despite the clear aesthetic components in fashion, fashion has generally been viewed as a commodity, whereas art is associated with a higher aesthetic realm. So because this is art, the shoes and so on in it are not just the kind of shoes you buy at Saks Fifth Avenue, they're part of an artwork, and you pay a lot more for them. Now, bringing up the price of art, of course, paintings and sculpture and artworks like this are also commodities. And the art business is very much a business. And, but art is usually thought of as somehow transcending its commodity status, in contrast with fashion, which seems to wallow in its commercial nature. Fashion has frequently been represented as art's other, and it's been seen as being particularly dangerous when it insidiously enters the citadels of art, quote, as though virginal art were at constant risk of defilement. Here you have this very sort of sexy Jean-Paul Gaultier advertisement, and it kind of conjures up the rhetorical language used by a lot of journalists. Whenever you have a fashion exhibition in an art museum, you can count on it. Some journalists will say, how can this museum, which has paintings by Raphael, also show fashions by Gaultier or Versace or whoever? This is not a new and purely journalistic idea. If you go back, even Shakespeare talked about what a deformed thief fashion is, and how fashion wears out more apparel than the man. So fashion, in many ways, has had a really bad rap for centuries, indeed millennia. I once wrote an article called Why People Hate Fashion. This goes on and on from the Bible on, and cross-culturally, in ancient China as well, people anathemizing fashion as being terrible. If you look at this ad, I think you can see one reason why people have looked down on fashion. Fashion is something worn on the body, and therefore it's associated with the physicality and the sexuality of bodies. Also, although in world historical terms, men's clothes have been at least as modish, outlandish, and rapidly changing as women's, fashion has been associated with women's bodies, and therefore also with ideas, misogynist ideas about women's vanity and culpability. So this idea that it's material, not intellectual or spiritual, it has to do with vanity and femininity rather than masculinity and high art, is something that goes deeply into our history. Because art, by contrast, has been associated with masculine genius, something we'll come back to later. So let's turn to the first famous couturier, Charles Frederick Worth. Voila. He claims to be an artist, and you can see he's wearing this hat like Rembrandt, which is something that Wagner also did. This is part of this late 19th century I'm an artist sort of look. And when he established his couture house in 1858 in Paris, at that point the couture was mostly a small-scale craft practiced by working-class women. And what Worth did was he transformed it from being this sort of small craft into being big business and high art. So here we see some pictures of a later male designer, Doucet, I think, not Worth, and then the traditional female dressmaker, couturier. Now there she is kneeling at her client's feet. Who's in charge? The client, not the dressmaker. But then by contrast, when the male couturier comes in, he's telling his female underlings, pin this, drape that. He's the great male artiste. And the press also treated the early male designers like Worth as being great dictators, who were famous for only allowing their clients to make small choices in what they would wear. So in accordance with this kind of romantic image of the great male genius, Worth, for example, talked about how he had to be inspired to come up with a dress. And Zola made terrible fun of this in one of his novels, which satirized Worth as a fictional couturier, Wurms, who would sink into ostentatious melancholy whenever he couldn't be inspired and think of a fabulous dress. So, another related strategy to emphasize how great the couturier was to focus on drawing inspiration from the high art of the past. So here we see a painting, I believe this is Mrs. Astor. She's wearing a dress by Worth, which is inspired by paintings by Van Dyck, and other famous artists of the past. And so in this way, they're reinforcing the idea that the dress is an artwork, Worth is an artist, he's inspired by great artists of the past. Most importantly, though, Worth was one of the first to introduce labels, the grief. It's like the signature of the couturier, like the signature of the artist on a painting. It authenticates the hand of the artist, and it makes the clothes much more valuable, today as in the past. So this is a Worth dress owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if you have at auction a Worth dress with the label inside, it will fetch up to 10 times more than a comparable dress without the label. The label's the sort of, it's like the logo of the past. It sort of certifies that this is the great artist's work. Meanwhile, while Worth was there wearing his velvet beret and touting himself as a great artist, there started to be some other artists who began experimenting with making fashion, or rather we should say anti-fashion. So here, for example, we have a dress by the architect and interior designer Henri van der Velde, and he was creating artistic clothing as an alternative to fashionable clothing. No corset, this beautiful kind of Art Nouveau curves, just as he designed houses and furniture with this beautiful Art Nouveau style, he'd also designed the dresses like it. And William Morris was in this area, and of course Oscar Wilde was famous for aesthetic dress. Remember Oscar Wilde's little quip that regular fashion was a form of ugliness that was so startling you had to change it every 6 months. You couldn't stand it anymore. Then later on, you had other artists, like the Futurists, who created anti-fashion. They're brilliantly colored suits for men, and clothes that were intended to be, again, anti-fashion, anti-bourgeois. This one here by Giacomo Balla. Now, although some of these artistic enterprises influenced fashion, both then and later, they did not take place within the fashion system. And the artists involved made relatively few garments, which were seen by everybody as being art garments, an alternative to fashion. Someone like Balla was clearly not a professional fashion designer. So whenever you see big exhibitions on fashion and art, you'll frequently see, here's some examples of futurist clothing, etc. But that's something very different than fashionable clothes from that period. By contrast, Paul Poiret was a couturier. He was a leading avant-garde fashion designer in Paris. He had worked for the House of Worth before being fired, and he styled himself, like Worth, as an artist. And he patronized advanced artists, kind of like Miuccia Prada, in his atelier, but he got them involved, more like Schiaparelli. So he got them involved in helping him with designing fabric and doing drawings for him. Poiret said to a journalist, Ladies come to me for a gown as they go to a distinguished painter to get their portraits on canvas. I am an artist, not a dressmaker. So there he is, emphasizing his connection to art. And he employed high art as a kind of rhetorical tool and struggled with the contradictions with that. And he hated to be copied, and he did work for the theater, and he had lots of different enterprises going that were intended to establish him as a multifaceted artist. By contrast, one of his great competitors, Coco Chanel, who loathed Poiret. She said that Poiret's brilliant colors made her feel nauseated, and that was one of the reasons she brought in black and beige and navy blue. And of course, he did all these ballet russe type Scheherazade Orientalist clothes, and Chanel, of course, said, Scheherazade is easy. A little black dress is difficult. But she also had a different attitude towards fashion as art. She was definitely on the side of those who saw that, or who believed that fashion was a part of modern life, it was a product. She liked being compared to, having her black dresses compared with Henry Ford's black cars, any color as long as it's black. She's quoted as saying, quote, "A dress is neither a tragedy nor a painting. It is a charming and ephemeral creation, not an everlasting work of art." And then I love this, she said, "Fashion should die, and die quickly, in order that commerce may survive." Her great competitor, as time moved on, after Poiret went out of business, then Chanel was confronted with another competitor, Elsa Schiaparelli. Well, Chanel loathed Schiaparelli. Chanel was a woman who was a good hater. She loathed Schiaparelli and described her dismissively as that Italian artist who makes dresses, with the clear implication that artists had no business making dresses. Schiaparelli, on the other hand, like Poiret, definitely saw fashion design as an art. She said it was not a profession, but an art. And she said that it was only by working with other great artists like Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau and Bébé Bérard and Verté, working with them, she said, made her feel, quote, supported and understood beyond the crude and boring reality of merely making a dress to sell. So together with her collaborations, she and particularly Dali made some of the most famous early surrealist dresses, which are also always shown in big exhibitions about fashion and art. So you have this back and forth then. You have, as a modernist, Chanel was committed to fashion as an aspect of contemporary life. By contrast, Poiret and Schiaparelli said fashion was a form of theater, a kind of performance art. All of them, however, you see, worked within the fashion system, the high fashion system based in Paris. They were all couturiers. And fashion has traditionally been taken more seriously as an art form in Paris than in the United States. Now here we see the couturier from the 1940s and 50s, Jacques Fath. He was kind of the third of the great male designers, along with Dior and Balenciaga in the late 40s and 50s. In 1954, Fath told the press, "Fashion is an art, art is creative, and men are the creators." Meanwhile, of course, the journalist, being a good journalist, went around and interviewed other female designers, and they all kind of said, "Hello, what about Chanel and V&A and Schiaparelli?" But of course, by 54, none of those people were working anymore. In fact, I think Chanel was so annoyed by this, it's one of the reasons that she went back into business later on. But at this point, you have a period in time when men were promoting themselves as the great designers. It's really fascinating because in the 1920s and 30s, between Poiret and Dior, it was the great age of the female couturier, the golden age of the woman designer. And actually, even male designers like Jean Fatou had to say, "Hello, men can design women's clothes too," because the assumption was, no, for the modern woman in the 1920s and 30s, who better to design for her than another modern woman? Because fashion is part of life, part of modern life. But by the 50s, fashion has become this big, big business, costs a lot of money to set it up. Dior gets backed by Boussac textile interests. You need a lot of clients. You have to promote the designer as a creative genius. Who better than a man, right? Who better than a man to tell women what to wear to please other men? So this preponderance of males, I think, may have contributed to a growing trend in the fashion press toward emphasizing the genius of designers. And here we see one of the geniuses, Balenciaga. Chanel, who went back into business, then in 1956, she answers, in effect, Fa. And at this point now, she's hating what she described so homophobically as those pederasts, Dior and Balenciaga, who said, never had a woman, they don't know women, I'm the only one who can dress women. But anyway, she also opposed them because they did art fashion. So she said, why do you work in the realm of genius? We are not artists, but producers of dresses. The essence of an authentic work of art is to appear ugly and to become beautiful. The essence of fashion is to appear pretty and to become ugly. We do not need genius, but much workmanship and a little taste. Now, just going back and forth, what Balenciaga did not claim to be an artist himself, the way Fath had or Worth had. But he did say, as Balenciaga, a couturier must be an architect for the cut, a sculptor for the form, a painter for the colors, a musician for the harmony, and a philosopher for the style. He was not only a meticulous craftsperson, who was capable of, as you see here, reworking an armhole up to 18 times to get exactly the effect he wanted. He was also a master of innovative three-dimensional design. So, at the beginning of my talk, I showed a picture of a Balenciaga dress. And I said, in a museum, it can be treated as art. It has the aura of art. So here we look at another one. This one's from a museum at FIT collection, a really important Balenciaga dress. Such a dress was obviously produced by a couturier, working within the structure of the fashion system, the couture system in Paris, not by a person trained as an artist. His work was not sold and exhibited in the art world. The dress was also produced, needless to say, for a different purpose. It was produced to be worn by a lady. And yet, perhaps the original function of the object doesn't trump all other interpretations. Because museums are filled with objects that served other purposes, what you might call utility purposes, but now serve aesthetic purposes because they're seen as being works of art. So the fact that it was supposed to be worn by a lady doesn't necessarily mean it's not art. But many designers have made that argument, fashion designers. Quite recently, Ray Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons, one of the most creative fashion designers in the entire world, denied yet again, as in many interviews, that she is not an artist, that fashion is not art. She said fashion relies on the body to be worn, and it doesn't have an independent existence. And then she said, and also it's connected to the now. It's right this moment. And yet, is the body necessarily necessary? We go back and forth with this aspect. People often complain about museum shows that they hate seeing the dresses on mannequins. They want to see them on a living, moving body. Otherwise, they look like, kind of ghosts or old rags or something. I've never quite understood that. It's a different way of looking at it. You abstract it on a mannequin. But that certainly is something that a lot of people complain about. Thinking about it in this way, though, even though this dress was designed by couturier, bought by a lady, and eventually, bless her heart, donated to the museum at FIT, by entering into a museum collection and being placed on display there, this dress automatically, inevitably, acquires more art-like qualities, just by virtue of being put in a museum and put on display. In addition, over the years, there's developed a whole discourse, a kind of aesthetic and scholarly discourse about Balenciaga's work. So people have been talking about him and the sculptural effect of his work. You can see here how he was inspired by different painters like Zurbaran, and the way he has this dress with the hem in front, and so when you move, it will flow in back of you. So he's designing it to be worn by a moving body, but he's also being inspired by clothing, including monastic clothing and earlier works of art. And this kind of discourse also tends to give at least the work of a really great designer, like Balenciaga or like McQueen, a kind of art-like authority. As my friend, the late Richard Martin, once wrote, Balenciaga and other great designers, quote, let the cloth speak in the same way that Morris Louis let the paint speak. So, another theory there. Within his lifetime and afterwards, Yves Saint Laurent was often compared to an artist. In part, of course, because many of his clothes were directly inspired by art, like the famous Mondrian dress, but also because they were of very high quality, because they seemed to bear witness to the social and aesthetic issues of the day. I mean, this was a period of pop art and young people, and when he did these Mondrian dresses in '65, you can see that he's done more than a lot of copyists. He's really taken the geometric patterns from Mondrian's abstract paintings and not just appropriated them, like a lot of designers do, but thought about how the planar, the flat aspects of this kind of A-line dress from the mid-'60s, that is a bit like a canvas, where you have the flat surface and the forms on it. So he's turning the dress, in effect, into a kind of canvas. It's really fascinating, and I think much more aesthetically successful than some of his other work, which would just take an image from Matisse or Picasso and put it on a dress. So there's that. When Diana Vreeland did her famous exhibition about Yves Saint Laurent in, I guess, 1983, it was the first time that a big art museum had done a major retrospective on a living fashion designer. FIT had done one the year before on Givenchy, who was still alive, but that was a fashion museum, so it wasn't seen as being that important. But when Mrs. Vreeland put Saint Laurent in the Met, it caused, some of you may remember, a huge controversy. Newspapers just were furious, and one reporter said that, it's for Art in America, said it was fusing the yin and yang of vanity and cupidity. The Yves Saint Laurent show was the equivalent of turning gallery space over to General Motors for display of taglines. And it was so clearly connected to the economic fortunes of the house of Yves Saint Laurent that it seemed totally crass. And the Met completely freaked out, and they passed a rule that from henceforth they would never do another one-person show about a single fashion designer. And they haven't since. They wait till they die, like Versace or McQueen, and then they do a show, or they combine it, like the Chanel and Lagerfeld, or the Schiaparelli and Prada show. Which is interesting because they don't do that for artists. You can have a one-man show of Neo Rauch or Damien Hirst in an art museum and nobody complains. But that's because art is more pure than fashion. Another big thing that happened, though, was in the late 70s and early 80s. The three great sort of avant-garde fashion designers from Japan emerged. Issey Miyake, Rei Kawakubo, Comme des Garçons, and Yohji Yamamoto. And the Japanese fashion revolution really dramatically changed the landscape of fashion. These designers succeeded in establishing a radically new aesthetic, a new attitude towards the relationship between body and clothes, a new idea of fashion, female beauty, and a renewed interest in the idea of fashion as art. So this famous picture, the wonderful Miyake Ratin bustier inspired by samurai practice armor. This picture appeared on the cover of Art Forum magazine. First time that we had fashion on the cover of an avant-garde art magazine. And although all three, Miyake, Yohji Yamamoto, and Rei Kawakubo, have said repeatedly fashion is not art, they nevertheless had an enormous impact on people thinking, well, most fashion's not art, but these guys are art. And they're usually shown as art. In fact, when I did my show about Japan Fashion Now, I had to make a conscious decision that I was not going to show Japanese fashion as sculptural form, abstract art, because that's how they were always shown. And I wanted to show them as part of real life in Tokyo and sort of react against that assumption that Japanese avant-garde fashion equals art. So our forum featured this, and inside there was an editorial by Ingrid Sishi and Germano Gelat, two art critics, very important. And they suggested that fashion might be, this new Japanese fashion, might be, quote, a new kind of art making that retains its autonomy as it enters mass culture at the blurred boundary of art and commerce. So somehow the Japanese were making this magical transition that somehow it could be autonomous, it could really be art, even though it was mass-produced and it was commerce. Significantly, there also developed a real discourse around Japanese fashion, where lots of scholars were writing about it and talking about the aesthetics of decay and deconstruction and, Japanese aesthetic philosophies like wabi-sabi. And again, although some of the Japanese designers said, hello, I'm not doing wabi-sabi, it made no difference. By this discourse getting established, you were using aesthetic terms to describe Japanese fashion in a way which again got people thinking about it in a new way. So the development of this kind of theoretical and aesthetic framework for understanding fashion is almost certainly one of the key criteria for any attempt to define fashion or some kinds of fashion as art. You've got to have a discourse around it that's talking about what's art like about this kind of fashion. Richard Martin, who I mentioned before, who used to be in charge of the museum at FIT and then went to the Costume Institute at the Met before his early death a few years ago. He was an art critic turned fashion curator, and he really emphasized the art aspects of dress. And it's something that's been taken up subsequently by a number of other curators and art critics. But Richard, I remember, published a little article way back in the early 80s where he tried to counter all the arguments that were made, fashion is not art because. Some people would say, well, fashion is trivial. And he'd say, no, it's a real cultural and social artistic form. And people would talk about, well, the artist works alone, but the fashion designer is part of an industry. And he'd go, well, many artists have worked in a workshop environment, and that's been perfectly acceptable. And anyway, you have an opera, that's a communal production. Filmmaking is a communal production. So you can't make arbitrary distinctions like that. And of course, coming out of the field of contemporary art, he knew that contemporary artists were saying, I'm doing art, but I'm not doing that old style of art. And that's something we're going to be coming back to in a minute, because changing definitions of art have had a big impact on changing definitions of what fashion could be. But I want to end with Richard by quoting about, from this article, an interview actually, where he said, one of my touchstones has been the art world / fashion world connection. He said, I have a dream of visual culture, whole and thrilling, end quote. And to the extent that instead of thinking in terms of art history, he thought in terms of visual culture, well, hey, fashion is definitely part of visual culture. So, new types of fashion exhibitions began to be held, sometimes explicitly linking fashion to art. Richard did a wonderful one with Harold Koda in 1987 called Fashion and Surrealism. And then the genre got underway with the big Biennale in Florence looking at fashion. And that moved to the Guggenheim, art and fashion. And you had all kinds of shows which were exploring this. You had Addressing the Century at the Hayward Gallery. And fashion criticism more and more started to appear. In my own magazine, Fashion Theory, a number of people have submitted articles about addressing the relationship between fashion and art. Sungbok Kim, for example, did an essay, Is Fashion Art? And she called for, quote, more high-level interpretations of fashion, which would, quote, provide the basis for critical judgment in fashion writing, end quote. Something comparable to art criticism. So more than, just saying what the trends are, but trying to talk about the fashion in those terms. Scholars also began to analyze the fashion show as an artistic phenomenon. Now, although I'm sure everybody here has been to a million fashion shows, and most of them are very stereotyped. They're girls walk up and down the runway fast, and that's it. It's over in 10 minutes. But some, and that cost like $50,000. But some designers made fashion shows which were more like theater or like performance art. Here, of course, we have Kate Moss, the hologram, one of the most famous Alexander McQueen fashion shows. And I think one of the reasons for the great success of the amazing McQueen show at the Met was precisely because the curators worked with McQueen's colleagues who helped put his stories and his dreams into theatrical form during his runway shows. I mean, I remember once in the conciergerie in Paris, and we're waiting there in the sort of prison where Marie Antoinette had been kept, and you could suddenly hear wolves howling, and then the first model came out with 2 wolves on leashes, and the hair on the back of your neck just stood up. It was just an amazing transformative moment. It wasn't just a fashion show, it was theater. And you know, others as well, like Hussein Chalayan, have done things which were more like performance art. And fashion photography, too, has been getting growing attention, and people have been not just dismissing it as commercial photography, but saying, you know, again, if you're taking art photography seriously, maybe you shouldn't throw out fashion photography completely. So, curators, critics, designers continue to debate the intersections where art and fashion meet. My favorite comment of all time is Karl Lagerfeld's, when he said, "Art is art and fashion is fashion." However, Andy Warhol proved that they can exist together, end quote. Fantastic quote, because he has it both ways. Lagerfeld has often said fashion is not art, but then by throwing in Warhol, he throws in the real kind of key monkey wrench in the picture, because Warhol is the one who really called into question, what is art? After seeing Warhol's Brillo boxes, for example, the philosopher Arthur Danto came to the conclusion that, and I quote, "anything can be art," end quote. Now, this doesn't mean that everything is art, but it makes it impossible to just give an easy answer to the question, is fashion art, without reassessing the questions of what art is and then what fashion is. So, with, of course, the super dress, which is a commercial product, a paper dress, which was manufactured in many, many thousands, was sent out for $2 to people, inspired by Andy Warhol's soup paintings, which were so shocking, because how could that be a work of art? Bring this up here to talk about the idea of what the work of art is. I'll bring up another one here. It also calls up the same question. This is a Versace, of course, and he's taking images from Warhol's paintings of James Dean and Marilyn Monroe, again, which were calling up questions for a lot of critics about what art was. Now, I'm sure you've looked at Pierre Bourdieu, and I'm giving you a little bit of heavy theory here, but bear with me because it's important ideas. According to Bourdieu, quote, "the work of art is an object which exists as such, as a work of art, only by virtue of the collective belief which knows and acknowledges it as a work of art." So it's like Tinkerbell. Remember when Tinkerbell is dying and you have to say, "We believe in you, Tinkerbell," and that keeps her alive? Same thing with art. You're saying, "We believe this is art," and that makes it art. It's only our collective belief that makes it art. However, like Animal House, some of us are more important than others when it comes to belief. So, contrary to popular belief, art is not the product of pure, disinterested, creative activity on the part of an individual genius artist. No, it's socially instituted. And it doesn't just involve the material production of the artwork, the painting, the sculpture, perhaps the dress. Also necessary is the, quote, symbolic production of the work, i.e. the production of the value of the work, or what amounts to the same thing, of belief in the value of the work. Really interesting idea. So it's almost a form of magical thinking that makes it art. The field of cultural production involves, quote, not only the direct producers of the work, the artists, the sculptors, the painters, the writers, but also the producers of the meaning and value of the work, critics, publishers, gallery directors, the whole set of agents whose combined efforts produce consumers capable of knowing and recognizing the works of art as such. Like last night at the auction, all these people are there, okay, I believe that this is an artwork. I believe this is worth my giving money for. Bourdieu further distinguished between what he called legitimate works of art. That's easy. Old master paintings, classical music, and art in the process of legitimation. And when he was writing in the 70s, as art that's in the process of legitimation, he gave us examples, cinema and photography. Now, 40 years on, cinema and photography have been pretty much accepted as art forms. MoMA has a photography department, has a cinema department, so jazz is accepted at Lincoln, at Kennedy Center. These are all accepted now as art forms. So cinema, jazz, photography are now accepted as art. It seems to me useful then to think of fashion as potentially another one of the arts in the process, still very much contested, of being legitimated as art. So let me show you a few more pictures to give you a sense of how this means. Here's Saint Laurent. He's underneath this Matisse painting. And you know, the Matisse is accepted as art. His work, well, some people accepted it as art, others didn't. His longtime lover and partner, Pierre Berger, used to always insist that, Saint Laurent was an artist. And once there was a Warhol show, and Warhol had paintings of artists and paintings of designers, and Berger pulled the things out and lists. The Saint Laurent could be listed with the artists. And he was supposed to be considered one of the great artists of the 20th century. Hussein Chalayan. Now, Chalayan is interesting because this brings us back to the thing which I just touched on in passing, people studying in art school versus fashion school. You think, what's the most prestigious fashion school in the world? It's probably Central St. Martin's. And St. Martin's is an art school. McQueen, Chalayan, Galliano, they went there and they studied fashion, but it was seen as being an art. And Hussein has done other non-fashion artworks. And he's talked in interviews about, we were trained, it was just another form of art. It was like a form of body art. Now, he's pulled back from that in recent years and said that he feels more now that fashion is more commercial, it's more part of everyday life. But he got the training of it as thinking of fashion as being a kind of art. Here we have an example, much made fun of in a way, that the kind of Murakami plus Louis Vuitton collaborations. Very expensive Vuitton purse with Murakami's artwork transferred to it. Costs a lot of money, but it costs a teeny fraction of what a painting or even a print by Murakami costs. So you see a lot of the big fashion houses like Dior and Vuitton engaging in collaborations with famous artists to raise the prestige of their house as being like an artistic house. And Dior recently had the big show in Moscow at the Pushkin Museum, masterpieces, paintings all over the place, and then dresses presumed to be therefore masterpieces by Dior in front of those paintings. Kind of a strategy which is used by a number of luxury houses. Is this a work of art? I don't know. You can see the thought that's gone into trying to make it perceived as being an artwork. Here we have an artwork. I think this is Sylvie Fleury, an artist I love. And it's all the shopping bags. Now, when artists talk about fashion, they almost always talk about the stuff that fashion people, particularly heads of luxury houses, don't want you to talk about. They talk about rampant consumerism and labelitis and eating disorders. That's what they want to talk about in terms of fashion. But it's something that is an aspect of fashion and an aspect of art. You've got the artist commenting on it. And then I end with one other picture by a certified artist. This is a photograph of a performance piece by Vanessa Beecroft. I saw this performance piece in the Guggenheim Museum. And it was fascinating because it's a combination of naked, semi-naked models in high heels and bikinis or not bikinis, standing around with their Gucci shoes in atrium of the Guggenheim, and all of these richly dressed Italian men kind of circling around at the opening. And it was fascinating because it is a work of art, but that's entirely by virtue of the agreement among the art makers that that's what it is. And you got the distinct feeling that from the point of view of a lot of the guests, it wasn't art, but art gave them a great excuse to be sort of hovering vulture-like around these models. And you can bet if I went out, in a bikini and a pair of Gucci shoes, I would not be a work of art. So again, it's very much, are the Gucci shoes a work of art? Well, Gucci would like you to think so, but again, it all comes back to what we collectively are trying to decide is art. We can probably say that at no time in the future will all clothing be regarded as art. It's probably only ever going to be a specific subsection of luxury and or avant-garde fashion that's considered as art. But ultimately, it's going to be up to us to decide whether fashion is art, and if we even think it should be. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take a few questions now, and then I'm going to go out and sign books. But I'm delighted to take more questions now. I think we need more light. There we go. Last night it was the 3rd degree on stage, and here it's like sort of dim and gloomy. Are there any questions? Yes.
Who's your favorite designer and who's your favorite artist? If you're doing
Well, I mean, my favorite designer was Alexander McQueen. I think he was the most important designer of our day. And I think it's interesting, McQueen did feel that what he did was art. And I think that those of us who saw the McQueen show feel that that show made the best case possible of what he was doing was art. My favorite artist, Bronzino, I guess. That's going way back. I know contemporary artists, probably Gerhard Richter. Yes?
So how do you feel about all this like super fashion on TV, Tyra, I don't know, super
Tyra
model,
Banks?
yes, no, not Tyra Banks, the girl who has the fashion program where these models are becoming, famous models and designers are becoming famous designers, and everybody is so excited for all that.
Fashion is kind of a ubiquitous social phenomenon right now. And I think it's probably frustrating for a lot of people who are actual fashion designers to see the idea that, it's sort of the vox pop voting in great designers on these shows and minimizing the amount of effort and knowledge that you might need to be a designer. Certainly I've heard some outspoken fashion designers like Hussein Chalayan criticizing all the celebrities who've decided that in addition to being singers or actresses or whatever, they can also be a designer without really knowing anything about design. But this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, Madeleine Vianney used to say that Chanel was a very stylish woman, but she didn't have the skill set to be a couturier.
You mentioned that fashion was said not to be art because of the connection with the body, and that the body actually moves it away because that's kind of not a medium, but it's part of the process. But how did they take into account, for example, performance art, where definitely body is used?
Yeah, this is a great example of how modern and contemporary artists have confused the idea of what art is, and have done so in really interesting ways that have made fashion possible to consider as an art form. On the other hand, you do have to admit that a performance artist who uses clothes in the course of a performance is probably doing something different than someone who's wearing a piece of high fashion to a party, for example. And this came up actually too with the idea of Daphne. I think Daphne Guinness is the world's greatest fashion icon. And the discussion is she a kind of artist or performance artist of fashion? And I was talking with Guy Trebay, and he's like, well, she's extraordinary, and she makes these extraordinary appearances, but does it amount to a performance art as such? So still the tension's there, the lack of clarity. But that's a fabulous example of how definitions of art have changed tremendously over time. But knee-jerk attitudes often remain the same. Because I think a lot of the journalists who would say, how can you have fashion in an art museum, many of them would be journalists who would say, performance art isn't real art. Because they're still clinging to like an old master idea of art.
I think about, we're talking about this in Cindy Sherman and sort of, how she uses clothing and dressing up to, well, it's performance art, but doesn't she also just, sort of appear, not necessarily in a, artistic situation, using clothing as a disguise or a...
Yes. Well, Cindy Sherman is fascinating because, she's probably the most successful sort of woman artist or certainly woman photographer today, and it's very closely tied to her use of clothing as disguise and as costuming. What's very interesting to me is how she's been brought in to do that for the occasional sort of avant-garde fashion magazine or an avant-garde fashion house, like Comme des Garçons hired her to do them, because they weren't unafraid that she would make something grotesque or freaky out of their clothes. Whereas most mainstream fashion magazines and companies will be terrified of having an artist really get their hands on the clothes, because artists do stuff which tends to be messier and that at least the corporate suits in the fashion world don't like. One more? Yeah.
Who would you say among contemporary today are kind of the trendsetters in fashion, or kind of looking forward to things?
Oh, well, we're seeing a lot of interest right now in the sort of so-called new minimalism. Obviously, people like Celine, and I think also Hyder Ackerman is very interesting with this kind of both the brilliant color and the draping and tying. The two of them seem to be very, very interesting designers in terms of where to go. I'm also really a huge fan of Rick Owens. I think everybody owes a lot to Rick. Everybody's ripping him off right and left because of and he's a good example of someone who has incredible in-depth knowledge of pattern making, which most designers don't have any knowledge of. And because he has that knowledge, he can do things which are significantly different. I see one more person up there.
I was wondering how come you didn't incorporate Claire McCardle in this set? Maybe because she was a little, she left before she got a chance to incorporate her art into her fashion because she was always more functional.
Well, the lecture could go on and on. McCardle, of course, did do especially some collaborations with textiles with well-known painters. This is a kind of portmanteau topic which we could expand over the course of an entire semester, looking at different artists and their relationship to art. And we're just touching down on a few points.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much.